In the early 90s, the Department of Transport began to build a motorway on Chalk Downland near Winchester.
I trained myself to quite a few machines. Looking back now, I don't know how I did it. I think it has something to do with being 20 years old and thinking you're invincible.
Another demonstrator had used a bicycle lock around his neck.
At that moment, it really became apparent to me that, I was prepared to die for this cause.
The protest at Twyford Down was the catalyst for numerous others around the country. After 50 years and 2,000 miles, it seemed that our love affair with the motorway was over. There was a time in Britain when there were no motorways. But surprisingly, there were already motorway protesters.
I don't think we'd have been tying ourselves to trees, let's put it like that. It wasn't the done thing in those days, was it?
No.
It's probably...
Or standing in front of a bulldozer or anything like that. I can't... No.
No, it was...
It wouldn't have worked in the village.
We weren't so anarchic, whatever the word is in those days.
The route of the M1 around Leicester was planned in 1957. The engineers set out across the country to meet landowners and iron out any problems.
Motorway construction hadn't started. I mean, civil engineers were welcome in the areas. I mean, people were nervous about the not in my backyard syndrome, but I think in general they appreciated the M1 solution. Motorway's been heralded as the saviour of the country in those days. If you got objections, then, they were to be found a way around them or out of them.
I looked out of the window in the kitchen and I could see these people walking about with sticks with something on, and I didn't realise at the time that was surveyors. And then when we did realise there were surveyors, we thought, oh dear, I wonder if they're going to build a housing estate at the back of us. And then when the story broke, it was really devastating to think that we were going to have a great big motorway just above our house.
The proposed route ran through one of Britain's oldest natural forests and alongside Bradgate Park. This former home of Lady Jane Grey was now a public park, owned by the people of Leicester.
It was a beautiful place with the deer, and to put a motorway through the park was a stupid thing to do. It spoiled the whole thing.
Opposition to the route was led by Bob Bown. He was a local councillor and all in favour of the motorway. But in an age when holidays abroad were a rarity, he knew how important the park was to local people.
It was the first time he'd ever campaigned for anything, but he just felt so strongly. Particularly after the war years, people were getting back to normal living, and to have something else spoilt.
Bob Bown organised a petition, didn't he?
Yeah, and within a short time, how many signatures did they get?
33,000, I believe it was.
It was headlines because it was such a favourite park for all the people in Leicester. But it seemed to do the trick anyway.
Bob Bown took his petition to the Transport Minister, who was happy to reroute the motorway. Bradgate Park was saved. And the M1 opened to national celebration.
This motorway starts a new era in road travel. It is in keeping with the bold, exciting and scientific age in which we live.
The first 1,000 miles of motorway were built across open countryside with little opposition. They quickly relieved congestion on Britain's A roads and in its city centres. So, flush with their success, the motorway planners then turned their attention to London's problem.
Everybody knows that we're being invaded, devoured, and practically immobilized by our own machinery. We want cars, we need cars, and cars are beginning to destroy our civilization.
The rush hour, the twice-daily ordeal by frustration, which builds up neurosis, causes accidents, and costs millions in wasted time and fuel.
Rising car ownership meant that the protest against congestion was becoming louder. Something needed to be done. So the job fell to a new generation of computer-literate engineers.
Of course, we looked to what had happened in the United States because their car ownership was ahead of ours. But there was no reason to believe it would be any different.
The core of the city has been evacuated. The car is king.
We were some of the first British people to study these new approaches to transport planning. Our numbers were suggesting massive freeways were necessary. They might require dual 4 lanes, dual 5. And if there was a flaw in what we were doing, it was too much time on making the machine produce numbers and far too little time on serious, deep thinking about interpreting the numbers and what was the reality that they portrayed.
Were you worried about the prospect of the motorway?
Yes, we were indeed.
What worried you most?
We were always afraid a car come in the front room to us at some time or other.
Am I all right for Aylesbury on the A41?
Straight on, you can't miss it.
Residents were consulted, but the reality was that forcing motorways through London's densely populated streets was always going to destroy someone's backyard.
They're going to build a motorway through me back garden. No one can explain why I came to be chosen. They're going to build a motorway, they're ripping up the trees. Soon the lorries will be zooming through me cabbages and peas.
They do profess a facade, as you would put it, of democracy. And no doubt they would argue that there are facilities for you to protest and have your say on these things. But in practice, it's rubbish.
They talked of urban redevelopment, improving the environment. They says to ease the traffic flow, a bit of my back garden not to go. Well, I don't know.
We had quite a wide verge here, and it was very pleasant when we first moved in, but it's dreadful now. We're all very shocked about it, and we can't get any satisfaction.
They built a 9-lane motorway, they've ripped up all the trees. Now the lorries zoom where once I grew me cabbages and peas.
When a 2.5-mile section of elevated motorway opened in West London, residents were faced with 6 lanes of traffic, hurtling past their homes at bedroom level.
I have great pleasure in declaring Westway open.
It's a celebration for you, sir, but it's not proper.
And that the whole matter is going to be the subject of an urgent review by the government.
Yes, it's a lovely ride, but we're living in misery, sir, and we'll have to do something
Now,
about it.
who else have you got here who comes?
Everybody, sir, Mr.
Now the traffic is pouring past here. It's light at the moment. By 3 days, 4 days, it'll be intensely heavy. Meanwhile, the families in this road, and the 142 children like the youngster here, will have to sleep in the front rooms because there is no room at the back. And we are planning more demonstrations unless they assure us that something is going to be done.
All your neighbours are leaving?
Yes.
Do you wish you were going with them?
I certainly do, yeah. I've lived in this street all my life and I'm looking out now.
But the Westway was only the start. There was a much more radical plan in the pipeline. Inspired by American freeways, it was called the Motorway Box. 30 miles of elevated motorway, forcing its way through central London.
The Motorway Box is perhaps the most controversial of the proposals, since it involves a complete ring of 4- and 8-lane highways so close to the heart of London. The Motorway Box will have to be driven through some of the most densely populated parts of London.
With the newly opened Westway there for all to see, Londoners realised what the impact of the Motorway Box would be.
Well, I object to having things steamrolled over me without being able to say what I feel, and I found that a great many people felt the same way.
Homes Before Roads campaign believes things have been got out of perspective by County Hall.
Homes Before Roads was a new political party formed to fight the proposed motorway box.
Transport has been boosted up to a position which will dominate London.
The scale of the proposals was extraordinary. The so-called motorway box went through Kensington, Battersea, Lambeth, Hackney, Camden, tight-built Victorian terraces. So it was going to be this huge motorway, in many cases elevated, through all the inner London boroughs.
But how can you build any new road through London without taking down somebody's house?
Well, I think this is obvious. I mean, you certainly will take down somebody's house in building a new road. But in fact, we're talking here of taking down the houses or the homes of hundreds of thousands of people.
Homes Before Roads succeeded in putting up over 80 candidates in the 1970 Greater London Council elections.
This is a borough in which the so-called motorway box is expected to cut a swath through the housing. And there has been a very great deal of interest to see how many votes the Homes Before Roads candidates take away from the traditional parties.
The Homes Before Roads people tended to be literary and artistic and that sort of thing. I went to Oxford, I'd read history. The opponents were engineers, and I mean, looking back, you can see it as a conflict between modernizing engineers and reactionary historical and literary people.
But it wasn't just the engineers who disapproved. The established political parties and their candidates were none too keen on Homes Before Roads either.
I thoroughly disapprove of the Homes Before Roads. I think it quite wrong when educated people who should know better use elections of this sort, which are concerned not only with roads and homes, important as they are, but with education and with the care of old people as a pressure group. It seems to me not to be socially responsible, and I take a poor view of it.
A lot of people have been wondering how the Homes Before Roads candidates were going to do. They're opposed to the
Well, I'm pleased to say I'm now going to declare the result of this election.
We had all the enthusiasm and all the energy and all the optimism of young people, and I think we probably thought somewhere we were going to do well in the polls.
Cyril Keith Jacker.
Homes Before Roads.
1,037.
We didn't. We were thumped.
James Anthony Lemkin.
Conservative.
24,400.
The Conservatives won the election and were committed to building the motorway box. It was a defeat for Homes Before Roads, but they would have the final victory.
Day after day, people came to County Hall and explained why they didn't like the proposals, and eventually it got to the point where the Homes Before Roads policy had been adopted by the London Labour Party.
So when Labour regained control of the capital 3 years later, they immediately dropped the motorway box.
We thought we'd been vindicated. We were elated. We were thrilled. We thought, my goodness, in the end, we've won.
The author of the motorway box scheme, who was a chief engineer, was sacked from his job, and it was made clear to me that if I tried to resurrect any form of major road proposals for London, the same fate would befall me.
Opinion was changing about building motorways in London. Modernism was very destructive. It was very narrowly focused on getting modern roads built, getting comprehensive development done, and it didn't pay very much attention to the people themselves.
Around the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, there was a huge flip change in popular attitudes, from a belief in wholesale reconstruction of cities around the car to a belief in conservation, preservation of the existing city, limiting the impact of the car on the city to the maximum extent possible. It was one of the biggest and most sudden psychological changes I've ever observed, and I think that ever occurred in the history of the 20th century.
It was clear that building urban motorways was now a non-starter. But out in the countryside, government plans were still going ahead. In the early 70s, the M25 was known as the M16. To the north of London, its planned route ran through Epping Forest.
Upshire was a sleepy little hamlet, and nothing very much happened. It was basically still agricultural. And as a result of inquiring from somebody about a reservoir, we were told there was a motorway projected to come through Upshire, right through the middle of the village. Well, of course, people were up in arms. We did have people standing outside their front doors with guns saying, "They shall not pass." I think I've got some photographs of it somewhere.
Anyone that comes here, I'll shoot his guts on that floor.
These are people whose lives were going to be dreadfully disturbed, and they were kicking against the pricks. They didn't know what to do.
We don't stop progress. I've been in roads and sewers all my life, but we never went mad like this. They don't want to come down here, because I tell you that old gun of mine, I do 'em honest.
With your shotgun?
Yes, I will.
I see.
Yes.
Everyone was absolutely devastated, because the one thing that you felt in Upshire was secure, because we're in the green belt and Epping Forest is protected by Act of Parliament. And then all of a sudden there was the government actually proposing to put a motorway in their own green belt, and it was a huge sense of betrayal.
It's where the people from East London in particular used to come out on their breaks and their day off. They've loved it. They've always loved it. I mean, this is one of the most treasured possessions of the people of this part of the world. How could they drive a motorway through it? So a protest group was formed.
I think without Joyce we might not have been quite so brave.
We decided to send a Christmas card to the Environment Secretary. Went with a poster which said, "Not Epping lightly."
We'd have wanted to do the same things.
The F's were very enlarged.
We wouldn't have believed ourselves capable of doing a lot of the things that we did do.
The goat was called Vanessa. She was photographed all over the place.
And to a person from a loving, stable, working class background who hadn't really ever had anything to rebel against, this was quite amazing. It was an amazing group of people to be swept into.
In the summer of 1973, the campaign headed to London to deliver a petition to their local MP, Norman Tebbit.
It was in the national press. Got a good press. Got a very good press. It's all very well getting a good press, but doesn't impress the people that you want to impress.
Joyce's campaign had no effect on the government's plans. But because the protest was so vociferous, a public inquiry was called. So expert witnesses were hired to explain why the motorway should be abandoned.
We were optimistic, and we thought our cause was just and that we would win.
It was then that the Upshire protesters discovered a catch at the heart of the inquiry system that meant their case was fatally flawed. It was a catch that meant the government would always win. Even today, guidance for inspectors makes the limits of their remit clear.
The inspector should be careful to confine his or her consideration to matters within the scope of the inquiry. The merits and foundations of policies adopted by the government are not matters for argument.
In other words, whether the motorway should or should not be built could never be questioned.
There seemed to be this basic assumption that they were right and we were just going through a process. And the further the inquiry went, the more one felt that. It felt as if you were playing with a loaded dice.
We were never going to win. It wouldn't matter what arguments we had put forward. The department had got their plan, and the department were going to stick to it. They weren't going to listen. We didn't stand a dog's chance in hell.
A key section of the M25 motorway around London was opened today through Epping Forest. It means traffic from the north...
When that road opened, I felt as if something had gone that wasn't ever going to come back. That was the last time that you would have complete quiet. It was the last time you would have complete dark.
I was brought up in a very law-abiding family. I'm also a magistrate, and I did think that right would out, and I really did believe it. I don't anymore. I don't.
The defeat at Epping had an effect around the country, as Middle England began to realise that there was no point playing by the rules.
Not a road that others have decided would fit into a nice little neat geographical plan.
There was a loss of faith in public inquiries. Protesters began to voice frustration at a system they no longer believed in.
In a call for a motion of no confidence in the chair. Thank you.
Next witness.
I wish to protest. This inquiry is a travesty.
Silence in court.
This is not a courtroom.
'Tis a courtroom.
It is not a court, it's an inquiry. And you are not fit to conduct it.
Well, madam, I am conducting it, fit or not. Now be silent.
You're a senile old fool.
At Winchester, where the M3 was due for completion, the planned route for the motorway ran through some of England's finest countryside.
Well, at that time, I was a master at Winchester College, and the proposed motorway went right across college land. The water meadows were extremely important, and then you have this meadow along which Keats used to walk and wrote the Ode to Autumn.
Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless, with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run.
And suddenly all this very best landscape, they were proposing to build a road, and that just seemed to me to be wrong. I couldn't think of any reason, short of warfare, and even then, for destroying beauty like that, and for such a poor reason as to give people 2 or 3 minutes saving on their journey to Southampton, just seemed ludicrous to me. So it seemed to me it was something essential to fight.
At first, the protesters planned to follow the usual route of presenting their case at the public inquiry. But then they heard of a radically different approach.
Mr. Rich, my solicitor is locked outside.
It was an approach that wouldn't just question the need for this particular motorway, but the legality of any motorway. And it was one man who led the way.
You will allow those people into this inquiry, or you will close it down now.
Polytechnic lecturer John Time was becoming a familiar figure at public inquiries around the country.
Their homes are threatened and they have no law to protect them in this room.
He was protesting against all roads, but he realized that the constraints on the inspector meant that no protest could ever be successful. He knew public inquiries didn't work.
They have no rules.
John Time was, I would think, an obsessed man, and he certainly saw motorway building as part of some great conspiracy. To some extent, I think he probably was right, but he was very, very determined and very inspirational.
Inquiries into motorway proposals, which in themselves are monstrously destructive across our countryside, are wholly invalid.
John Time was the obvious voice that had started this, and I don't know how he came to be invited, but it was quite conspiratorial when it happened.
Do you hate motorways?
Of course.
You hate them?
Of course, yes.
Your ex-wife died in a car crash. Could it be that subconsciously that is the basis of your hatred of the motor car and road traffic?
One should never deny
the possibility of subconscious roots. We don't know what the springs of our actions are. It may very well be, yes, the sufferings that my children underwent. When I think of the 7,000 people killed on the roads a year, I just wonder what, in fact, the road lobby, how they manage to sleep at night. Motorways are constructed on the bones of dead children.
John arrived in Winchester just before the inquiry was about to start to explain his tactics.
We had this meeting in my living room as I was a housemaster, and John Time was there. There were a lot of people there. John explained what he wanted to do, and what he wanted to do was to disrupt the inquiry to begin with, as long as possible, to prevent the DOE carrying on in its old way.
So I tell you this, that if you allow this inquiry to open, you will get your motorway, no matter what or who says what. What I suggest you do is put every single atom of power you have to stopping any inquiry being held. Stand on your feet and you will defeat this DOE. You will knock them flat and they will never get up again.
In essence, John Time's approach was to stop the inquiry opening, because if it didn't take place, building the motorway would be illegal.
And that was something that had never occurred to me. Never occurred to me to act that the inquiry could actually be stopped.
Inside the Guildhall, Major General Edge, hoping to preempt an outburst, slips on stage early.
It was full of expectancy, the whole room. I don't know whether we really believed we could do it. We had all been inspired, I think, by John Time, but I guess none of us really knew whether other people were really going to do this or not.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
I think it got as far as good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
It's now 10:30.
I represent,
It just snowballed. I mean, lots and lots of people were taken out. Eventually, even the headmaster of Winchester College was taken out. He was a sort of pillar of respectability, and he had to go.
We shall indeed treat you fairly in the civilised Winchester manner. But we cannot do that, sir, if we feel uneasy about the roots of our democracy.
To everyone's surprise, the tactics worked. Major General Edge made an extraordinary announcement. For the first time, an inspector was prepared to consider whether the motorway was needed at all. He told the ministry to think again. The protesters had won. The plans were shelved and Winchester's water meadows were saved. Now there was a way of stopping motorways being built.
Without George, the Archway Road would now be widened and we would now have a great big motorway right through Islington. George has a piratical view of life. He doesn't take anything for granted, and he comes from Austria, from Vienna, so that he wasn't quite as squashed as a lot of English people are, surrounded by the walls of thought that they set up for themselves. He's a very free-thinking person, and he was indefatigable.
If there ever is something like a Nazi government, which I suppose I experienced in my very young days, British bureaucrats will carry out that policy far better than the Nazis ever did it for far longer. For people living here, it is a fact that Goering with his bombs was less their enemy than the Department of Transport, which is supposed to be working for us.
In 1976, the government intended to turn a 2-mile section of the A1, running through North London, into a motorway. Houses along the Archway Road were bought up so that they could be demolished.
The most horrific aspect, I think, is this destruction of homes and the making of other homes which are not being destroyed, largely untenable because they'll be next to a motorway. This is what I find so horrific.
George and Nina had learned from events at Winchester and knew that civil disobedience could scupper government plans.
I was thrown out of the 76 inquiry. I think